Is it not in Iraq where the missionary spirit of the people rose up, saturated with the aroma of prophecies and divine grace? Otherwise, what would tie those who live today with those who shed their blood when they went into eternity before and during the mother of all battles? Those heroes died so that the banner of the Islamic nation might again be upheld after it had been marred by the agents of the enemy and those worthless infidels, casting shame upon the whole nation when the raging Zionism burst forth and formed a grotesque alliance with America. Now it became almost impossible to imagine that the horror of the enslavement of the whole world by this alliance could ever come to an end, and that resistance to this alliance could ever bring any positive results. The sense of defeat that this alliance brought not only struck those in power, but also weakened those whose names had just recently been on the lists of the most progressive and revolutionary parties and movements and individuals. It is not surprising and comparable to a miracle that Iraq rose up, saddled his horse, unsheathed his sword, and cried out, "I am Iraq, the only one in the whole earth, declaring firmly for all to hear, you, brutality and lawlessness, stay where you are or retreat. This is the land of prophets and heavenly utterances." As Allah was looking upon him from the heights of the heavens, Iraq thundered in a loud voice, "We shall not bend our knee before any but Allah. Let all the cowards and compromisers and traitors get out. We shall not capitulate. Let all the Arabs who have forgotten that they are descendants of Yarub and that they worship Allah alone get out." Iraq was the country of prophets and revelations, the country of civilizations, of merchantry and of purity, where the first plant sprouted and milk flowed from the udder, so that there was life, and so that there was the world in all its virgin purity and sins, with all the sweetness and bitterness of life. Iraq has been the land from which the doors open to heaven for those who rise there, and to hell for those who are destined to burn in its flames. Iraq, the land of Sumer and Akkadiya, Babylon and Assyria, established civilizations, Baghdad and Samarra, the country of famous hawks and noble beauties, a land without which there would be no sun, and without which the moon would not find its way in the sky, nor would plants sprout to the joy of the farmer and to the envy of the infidels, nor would there be rain.
Well, I'm not a crook. I burned everything I've got.
A military-industrial complex.
A new world order.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
It's been time to deal with it.
На полный разгром гнусных захватчиков.
Myth20c podcast.
Welcome to the Myth of the 20th Century, where we will be discussing today Saddam Hussein, the notorious dictator of Iraq and all-around probably not stand-up guy. I'm Hank Oslo, and I'm joined here by my co-hosts, Adam Smith.
Hey, everyone.
Hans Lander.
Hi, everyone.
And Nick Mason with that very compelling intro.
Inshallah.
So, Saddam Hussein was born in 1937, date somewhat unclear, in a village a few miles outside of Tikrit. He was almost certainly a bastard, born to a peasant family of no particular renown. His mother had remarried a stepfather who had routinely beat the crap out of him. He rapidly sort of spiraled into a life of random thuggery, bullying, and assault, beating up random neighborhood kids, being bullied in turn, assaulting the livestock, etc. He later found sort of one might say a metaphysics in life by moving in with his uncle, a Arab nationalist and a self-described fascist and national socialist, circa early 1940. This uncle was involved in 1941 in an anti-British revolt, spent a spell in prison, and after his release, they both became heavily involved with the world of Arab nationalism, sort of associated with the rise of Nasser in Egypt. Saddam.
That was a very big thing, by the way, in the entire Middle East. Nasser was sort of the leading light. It inspired Gaddafi, people like that. And it probably was very popular in places like Iraq and other Arab countries.
Oh, absolutely. Nasser is like a formative figure in the 20th century. He's one of the most important historical figures, I think.
He was like directly responsible for taking the institutions that the British had left behind in Egypt and turning Egypt into sort of the regional Sunni powerhouse of North Africa and of the Arab world for, until now, essentially. Egypt is still sort of the preeminent military and economic power in the Middle East for a lot of reasons, and Nasser is ultimately responsible for that.
Worth noting as well that there were many prominent, there were a few key National Socialists and fascists from the Western world who were seeking an alliance with Nasser. That's another show.
Right. I mean, Saddam's uncle, this 1941 revolt in Iraq was essentially in alliance, effectively, if not explicitly, depending on which faction you're talking about, with Nazi Germany. This is, the Jonah Goldberg, Iraq is the real Nazi thesis, which is not inaccurate. In its heyday, it was essentially the world's longest-lived National Socialist state for all the good it did them. And to your point about Nasser, his influence in Egypt was just kind of totalizing, but even in the broader Arab world, it sort of sparked this sort of genuine thread of endogenous pan-Arabism, where you had pan-Arabist parties like the Ba'ath Party, which was itself sort of multinational, springing up at least in Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Jordan before it was crushed, and all of the sort of surrounding countries.
Do you have a moment to explain pan-nationalism? Because I hear this term and it sounds like, nationalism, but I'm not sure about the pan part. And the pan maybe implies something to do with how Iraq, Saddam was having ambitions to sort of take over the Middle East somehow, and at the same time, Egypt was sort of trying to play a role.
It was not kind of pictured as a takeover type thing. It's kind of like, there's this debate on the right about kind of a European nationalism that's in some sense kind of pan-European versus sort of many European nationalisms.
Right.
And to what extent those are, each one is sort of empirically valid or ideologically compatible, and at what point they end up being at cross purposes. Arab nationalism as a thing, kind of from you could draw it back to even the 30s or so, and kind of between then and when it effectively died, maybe sometime ignominiously in the 80s. It was sort of this idea that the multiple Arab nations, because of course somebody in Libya is going to be have much different interests than somebody in Yemen. But these multiple Arab nations sort of had a common cultural heritage and a common desire to establish themselves independently of Western domination.
Well, it goes back further than that. I mean, there were several revolts, sort of pan-Arabist revolts against the Ottoman Empire in the final days of the Ottoman throne. There were a lot of, I guess, royal families in exile, you could call them, who were working with Europeans to break away from what was then just sort of this collapsing, decaying empire, and they failed several times. And it was down with the House of Saud. You had several houses in what became Syria, several houses in what became Mesopotamia, or then Iraq. Like there's this huge movement to bring Arabs together and get them away from Turks and Greeks, which they saw as this sort of ultimate problem for like the continuation of their culture. And they really never succeeded. They really only got what they wanted after the Europeans came in and created Sykes-Picot, which was the agreement to divide up the Middle East between the French and the British. And Lebanon and Syria, I believe, went to the French, and then the British got Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, and the entire Arabian Peninsula.
Yes, and this was a specific betrayal of the promises that were made by T.E. Lawrence to the Arabs who fought under him.
Right.
This is the famous Lawrence of Arabia of movie fame.
Yeah, in this particular podcast host's opinion, the betrayal of pan-Arab nationalism was the single greatest crime of the British Empire in the 20th century.
Well, I mean, let's be honest
debatable.
with ourselves. Like, Arab nationalism was never going to be a thing. Like, you had actual functional. At one point, you had a united Arab republic between Egypt and Syria, and it never really worked. It sort of immediately factioned, and they sort of peacefully divorced after it became clear that it was just not going to work. Like, a united Arab polity, like Iraq barely functions. Like, I mean, you try putting together the entirety of the Arab Middle East, and like that's just a recipe for continual civil wars and the reemergence of coherent states.
Actually, could you talk about how Iraq even came to be? Was it after this Second World War or First World War? What was the timeline on that? Do you know?
So,
yeah, it was the... Well, go ahead, Hans.
Yeah, I think pretty much it's Sykes-Picot created the modern, or what we think of as the modern boundaries of Iraq and Transjordan, which just became Jordan.
When was this? Is this after the First World War?
After the First World War.
Ottoman Empire broken up, and they're just carving things up. Okay.
Right, and you had not only the Ottoman Empire breaking up, but you had a specific rejection of taking some of these territories under their wing after Ataturk's guys took over Turkey. They were actually not interested in reclaiming any part of the old Ottoman Empire because in Ataturk's judgment, if I remember correctly, he thought it was too expensive, and it was the reason why the Turkish Empire declined, because they had way too much territory that they couldn't necessarily use properly. So this is really before the oil industry really gets going. I mean, the Iraqi oil industry goes back to like 1901, but it really wasn't developed. So the Turks had all this territory that they were spending a ton of money to protect, and they were getting no value out of it. But, lo and behold, after World War I, the British are quickly able to discover that not only is the oil industry in Iraq profitable, but that Iraq has a fifth of the world's, or the fifth largest oil reserve in the world.
Now, or that was the at the time the number they found.
I mean, that's what we think. That's what we've been thinking of throughout the 20th century. It's shifted back and forth, but I mean, the top ones are always like, I think Qatar or
Saudi Arabia,
Kuwait, Canada, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and Iraq. And so, with control of Iraq and control of Canada, effectively the British would directly compete with what was then the Soviet Union for control of the world's energy market.
I think the Middle East at the time was much more critical. I don't think the oil sands in Canada were very economic at the time.
No, but it was just, I mean, so even if they're not economic, you can still hold the market hostage and say, this is the amount of oil we have under our supply.
I think the United States at the time had more production. But anyway, that's getting into another show, I think.
So basically, and by the way, the British had also taken over Iran. They had the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, I think it was called.
It went on to become BP. We discussed this in the Iran episode.
Yes. I mean, the British, they pretty much made off like bandits in Sykes-Picot, because if you look at the map of the Middle East, of the oil supplies. The French were left with Syria and Lebanon, which have like almost no natural resources. They're well positioned geographically, and that's why pipelines are a big issue. And they have access to the Mediterranean. But the British were able to claim the majority of the mineral resources, the natural gas resources, and the oil resources.
And I should add. Oh, go ahead, Hans.
Well, yeah, and then basically Iraq comes out as a monarchy, and this monarchy is directly tied to the British monarchy, to the British crown. And it's sort of like this semi-autonomous state. It doesn't really have a lot of power, and it really doesn't have a lot of development going on. And in 1949, of course, this state of Iraq is couped successfully by General Qasim, who was sort of a military man. It was sort of left-wing at the time, wasn't fully pro-Soviet, but was certainly helped in a lot of ways by Soviet figures in the background. But prior to this, the British had tried to endorse some kind of Arab nationalism. The family that the British had put on the throne of Iraq was the Hashemite family. The Hashemite family is a pretty old name or tribal name that's been attributed to a lot of people in that region for a long time. And they are the same people who are the monarchy of Jordan to this day. So the monarch of Jordan to this day, I'm forgetting his name, but he's the Hashemite king of Jordan officially. They tried to unite them under like an Arab confederation in 48. And as soon as the coup happened in 49, that was abandoned, and the Hashemite family in Jordan was left to fend for themselves.
I just wanted to clear up, when I say is the worst thing that the British Empire did, I mean that obviously secondary to what the British Empire did to Europe. But as far as things that we are seeing play out in the current year, with respect to wars in the Middle East.
Well, they also helped Israel come into
Zionism.
being. Yeah.
Well, these things are directly related. That was my point.
Right.
The Zionist project was favored over the promises. So this created the geopolitical problem as well as the resentment in the Arab world that really didn't need to exist.
And I think Winston Churchill said that one of his biggest mistakes, or one of the biggest mistakes of Britain, was not creating an independent Kurdistan. Now, like whatever you feel on the Kurdish issue, not all of us here are necessarily pro-Kurd, but you can actually see why he might think that, because it's actually led to a lot of problems in the Middle East. Although I don't know if having an independent Kurdistan would have made the situation any better in the long run.
Hank, do you want to get back to Saddam, how he came to be?
Sure. So, in this sort of background of this kind of broader thrust of Arab nationalism, and specifically Saddam's uncle's involvement in Arab nationalism, this is the sort of intellectual milieu that he finds himself in, although he was by no stretch an intellectual at all. So, he, at some point, his schooling is a little bit unclear. I found a couple of different sources that have him sort of attending different sorts of schools at different sorts of dates. But he was about 20 years old and in school, and he drops out to join the Ba'ath Party and sort of pursue politics full time. And in 1958, there is a Baathist coup, broadly construed, led by army officers, kind of under the aegis of the Ba'ath Party, that removes King Faisal, the Hashemite king of Iraq, from the throne and puts in a military quasi-Baathist government. And where Saddam sort of pops into the scene, he isn't involved in that actual coup. But in 1959, after the leader of the original coup, Qasim, I believe.
Yes, General Qasim.
Right. He declines basically to join the United Arab Republic constituted at that time by Egypt and Syria. Basically, the Ba'ath Party feels that he's betrayed the Pan-Arab project, so they decide, well, we got to whack this guy. So who do we know around here who can shoot? And they all sort of look around the room, and they realize they're all college boys, and basically they settle upon Saddam and some other guys because they seem like they might actually be willing to go through with it. They completely botch this assassination attempt. They're supposed to kind of like sneak up on the car, and like one guy lights up the front row and the other guy lights up the back row. Saddam gets a little bit trigger happy as he's running up to the car and blows the whistle on the whole thing. Most of his comrades get either captured or shot. He himself is lightly injured and has to flee the country to Syria and then to Egypt. So at this point, he's like fully locked in to revolutionary politics, although like he does not at this point have that much sort of an auspicious background. But what does happen, and what probably helps him significantly in the future, is while he's in Egypt, there are embassy logs where he's routinely visiting the U.S. embassy and having contacts of some sort with some people in there. And given how he was treated when he was later captured and imprisoned, it's plausible that he was in contact with the CIA.
I think that's known. I mean, to be fair, like you're probably right.
It's extremely
pretty well.
And at this time, like Nasser is basically allied with the Soviet Union. So any sort of like ideological counterweight to that, where you could get like a basically non-Soviet aligned pan-Arab ideological faction, like you can get some money and prizes from your friends in America. So in Egypt, he basically behaves in an extremely thuggish manner. This is when you start to see some of the real instances of kind of like actually very parallel stories from how you see people like Stalin behaving, where he is again like attending some schools that seem to be the equivalent of like colleges of some sort, or possibly even like some secondary school, where he's like, you know, he's not an intellectual, so it really helps to pass your exams if you take your pistol out while you're taking the test to be more comfortable, as he put it. And then it turns out you pass the test first in your class. He gets in fights. He throws some Egyptian guy that he had an argument with out of a window. But basically he's on ice effectively, along with everybody else who had sort of fled this botched coup, which the General Qasim actually survived.
So he also attended the University of Cairo when he was in Egypt, and University of Cairo, I believe, has pretty old ties to the British government and the British services. So it's not out of the question that he could have also run into people who might have had contact with what would become MI6 over time.
Yeah, and like Cairo universities at this time is like, you know, pure ideology. Like that's like you're at the university because you're interested in politics. So, I mean, it's like going to like, you know, a fucking strip club in East Berlin. Like everybody there is like getting paid by somebody, or like trying to assassinate someone, or God only knows what. So in 1963, in February, there's a coup to remove Qasim again, this time led by some sort of more muscularly pan-Arabist Baathist officers. That actually succeeds. There's a large amount of bloodshed during the coup. A lot of people end up getting shot. There's a lot of sort of political purging. And at this point, Saddam returns to Iraq sort of under the Ba'ath Party aegis. And his first agenda item is sort of pulling a Pinochet and making sure that all the communists are dealt with.
Real quick, could you explain why people were trying to assassinate the leader of the country?
Yeah, I mean, essentially he was non-ideological, or the putative reason is that he's running Iraq as just like a country. Like, I'm just the general in charge of this country. And a lot of the people who formed his sort of support base were like, no, you're not like running the country just so you get to wear a fancy hat and like go on parades and stuff. Like, you're supposed to be working on like this broader project of like making sure the Middle East as a whole is like free of foreign domination and like advancing the actual progress of the country, not just like being the like head Arab in charge of like this tiny patch of land. So, I mean, that's the putative reason.
Yeah,
like, you can get,
I'm a little suspicious
get like
of that.
deeper with it because, like, you know, obviously there's other things going on. Like, probably there were, you know, at least one faction or the other of the U.S. and the USSR, I'm sure, had it in for this guy, although nobody's really clear on that. And there's always, like, you know, when somebody's in charge of, like, a shitty country, like, the shittier the country, the more people that are sort of vying to be in charge of it, ironically enough. So, I mean, it's kind of like the model where, like, the Krugman model of foreign currency crises, where as soon as it's possible to have a coup just sort of happens by osmosis. But regardless, Saddam shows back up and sort of ends up torturing, murdering, executing, etc. some Iraqi communists, as well as some kind of random people whom he had had grudges against in the past, like notably somebody who had refused to basically write him a check from party funds before he had fled the country.
So how does he do this? I mean, the current the government that he's ostensibly trying to overthrow is still in power while he's torturing communists, and this is somehow sanctioned,
So
or they look the other way?
He was not involved in the coup itself. So there's the coup in February. The coup succeeded. There was a lot of bloodshed.
Okay.
He's like, all right, so like, you know, / our guys / are now in charge of the country.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to show back up. I'm like a reasonably important guy in the party, so I'm going to be able to get a job.
Makes himself useful
and not have
as
to like
chief
not
torturer.
have to like dick around in Cairo.
Yeah, he was basically working as like a professional interrogator and torturer. And they were getting, this is the post-63 coup, right? So they're getting, at this point, logistics and intelligence and weapons through Turkey from the Americans to kind of form these anti-communist death squads in Baghdad and around the rest of the country.
Which, like, communism, like actual communism, not just sort of like communist promoted other ideological factions, was like a reasonable thing at this place and time, like in the sense that there is probably about as much buy-in to like capital C communism as there was into like specifically the Ba'ath Party. Like at no point before the sort of final coup in '68, which we'll get to later, were there more than like 5,000 Ba'ath Party members in the entire country. And yes, Iraq is about the size of Ohio. Like, it's not a small place.
Yes, reminder that as we've covered in our ongoing communist series, much of it is a smokescreen for geopolitical concerns and domestic concerns of the then burgeoning U.S. empire.
Well, it was also the USSR. I mean, it was also the Arabs trying to.
But the struggle was geopolitical, not ideological.
I think it's a factor. Right. Yeah. I think it's also just a bunch of guys trying to get power. I mean, don't forget that aspect.
That's what I mean by geopolitical.
That's totally it. Like
it's control.
You'll see this like go in hard. Like this pattern is like 100% clear. Like there's no like ideology in the Iraqi context is used as a mechanism for like thugs to congregate together. Like that is its function. It might as well be like if they were super into music, it might as well be like which band they like. But in any regard, this turns out to be sort of a short-lived situation because is this like 9 months later, from February to November? In November, there's a second coup, a sort of counter coup, where most of the Baathists are actually purged from the leadership, and Saddam finds himself in jail. So this is kind of a weird thing where, like, you know, many of his comrades, erstwhile comrades, are, you know, literally being tortured a couple of cells over. And Saddam is basically chilling like the prison scene from Goodfellas, you know, making his baba ganoush or whatever. He's not really the worst for wear at all. And in fact, in 1966, he sort of mysteriously escapes prison. There's this elaborate mythology that's not really credible that he has promulgated about how he escaped, but the most plausible explanation is that he was sort of allowed to escape, either because he was informing on some of his colleagues or had sort of some amount of protection from the U.S. Intelligence agencies, or maybe both.
Couldn't he have
like
also...
Chapo. It was a Chapo-style escape.
Yeah,
well,
exactly.
I mean, in the case of Chapo, I'm assuming it might be similar in that he basically offered a lot of these guys promises if he got out. And he's like, I'm credibly connected, help me out, I'll remember you, that sort of thing. I have no evidence for this. I just assume that's kind of how these guys operate.
Yeah, I mean, Saddam didn't really have anything to offer anyone in 1964. Like, the Ba'ath Party was, as we said, not that huge, and they weren't in charge anymore. So, like, there's no payoff, and it's a couple of years before he's able to sort of surface from the quasi underground. Like, he spends a couple of years, like, in this kind of odd circumstance. Like, you know, at the time, this is before really the oil wealth started kicking in. So this is just like a dirt poor country where, like, basically it's just farms is the only productive resource because you're not getting any sort of return from your oil wells.
Right.
So, like, I mean, he just sort of bums around, like hides out, like does the whole revolutionary underground thing for a couple of years, where he seems to be actually in contact with a lot of his surviving party members. He does this for a couple of years, and then we arrive sort of at the final coup in this. For those of you playing along at home, 5 coups over the course of 10 years. In 1968, there's the final coup, a bloodless coup, strangely enough, by Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr, who becomes the president of Iraq, in association with the rest of the Ba'ath Party, of course, some army officers, and Saddam, that removes the guy who had been put in charge after Qasim. After some sort of internal wrangling, Saddam doesn't really have like a constituency. There's nobody who really like owes him a bunch of favors. There's nobody that he really represents, and he's not particularly politically, hooked up at this time. But for whatever reason, Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr really likes this guy. And it's probably a case of like, this guy is willing to do a lot of my dirty work, and I can trust him actually to not get too political or to try to start a holiness spiral against me. So Saddam becomes the deputy party chief and assumes sort of operational control of a lot of aspects of the regime. And he sort of rapidly puts himself in charge of more and more parts of the functional aspects of the apparatus of the state. By 1976, he is effectively controlling the army. He has himself appointed a general. He's coordinating all of the sort of ambassadorships in foreign relations. He's a ruler in all but name, and then assumes the presidency in 1979.
So one of the big things he was responsible for before he actually assumed the presidency was several nationalization steps of the Iraqi oil industry. So in 1964, the same year that he actually went to jail, the Iraq National Oil Company, or INOC, was formed. And in 1972, and then again in 1975, after he had become, I think, chairman or something of the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, he nationalized the company's oil supplies and then completely stripped foreign production inside of Iraq's borders, which basically put the oil industry sort of under his thumb. And at that time, the oil industry was something like between 50 and 60% of the economy on any given year.
And this, immediately after he sort of ascends, first in 1973, and then kind of coincident with his presidency in 1979, the two oil embargoes cause massive price spikes that sort of allow them to engage in this process of basically nationalist socialism, where for the first time they're able to heavily fund schooling, especially sort of like engineering, like the stereotypical Arab pattern of development where you open up a lot of engineering schools to do a lot of infrastructure projects. All your smart guys become civil and electrical engineers, building roads, electrifying the countryside, etc. It's basically boom times in this period where you're going from completely abject 15th century equivalent standard of living as a peasant and some farmer, and suddenly it's wow, my son is going to university. I have electricity, I have television, I have radio, maybe I can even get a car, I have air conditioning, for God's sake.
There were some growing pains. There's a funny video from Varg, last name escapes me, but he's the Norwegian guy. Yeah, just wasn't sure on the pronunciation, but he's a big critic of kind of the modern world, but it just so happened that his father was an engineer, and they actually lived in Iraq right before the Iran-Iraq war started, and this was during the country's modernization push, and his father's an engineer, and so he was assigned to some project, and he gives just all these really frightening and hilarious anecdotes of just what the country was like. I mean, basically, they were just buying all these foreign contraptions that they didn't understand. There was an ice cream factory that the Danes set up, and then all the engineers were dismissed and replaced with the Iraqi equivalents. And then the ice cream suddenly wasn't available anymore, and then they brought the Danes back. They'd buy these cars from overseas, and they'd buy so many that they could just throw the ones that broke away, and because they didn't think about repairing them. It's just a crazy thing when it's when you take a guy from the ghetto and he becomes a famous rapper, and how he spends his money. That's basically what he's describing. I'll leave it to the audience to check that video out. I'll put it in the show notes, but it's there's a lot of good anecdotes in there.
So he actually won a UNESCO award for raising Iraq's quality of life when he was still, I was wrong earlier, he was vice chairman of the Ba'ath Party from 68 to 79. And he created a national literacy campaign, and he was setting up reading circles. And if you missed the class, it was punishable by 3 years in prison if you missed these reading circle classes.
Just like, this is the best, like, you know, like that anecdote is like perfectly sort of emblematic of like the kind of guy who ends up running Iraq.
Yeah.
Like, it's like classic Machiavelli, like, you know, it's better to be feared than to be loved, but if you can swing it, try for both. Like, you're going to go to class, you're going to like it, or we're going to throw you in an Iraqi dungeon.
Right. So they had like set up this plan, build roads, schools, hospitals, public health system, and then the UN gave them this, you know, honored achievement award for trying to get rid of illiteracy and other things in the country. And then throughout the 70s, the Baath Party plan, and really his plan, because he was really the puppeteer of the country at that point, was industrial development. And this actually goes into the heart of Baathist political economy views. When the Baathists say socialism or socialization, they don't actually mean Soviet socialism or even truly like Marxist socialism. They saw it purely as a way of industrialization, even if it, you know, had nothing to do with workers' rights or anything like that. It was purely about, we need to get the Arab world industrialized because the Arab world missed 2 industrial revolutions completely. And if it had not been for colonial expansion into the Arab world, and I guess in a way Turkish expansion, they would have had no idea of any of this going on, really. Because by the 14th century, the Muslim world, with the exception of the Turks, had completely missed any sort of scientific development. Part of that was the Mongol sacking of Baghdad, and part of it was just sort of civilizational rot. They had arrived at certain philosophical conclusions.
At which point the library of Baghdad was burnt down.
Yes. So in the 70s, it was all about import substitution. It was government setting up state-run enterprises that were partially privately owned, but pretty much like basic elements of what you would maybe call fascism. And they wanted to spread this around the country too, so that he purposefully put like food processing centers and manufacturing centers in different areas of the country so that it would not be too concentrated in one region. Again, this has to do with the fact that Iraq is really a 3-part, or maybe even more than that, but predominantly a 3-part state of Sunni Arab tribes, Shia, somewhat Persian Arabs in the south, and Kurdish Arabs, or not Kurdish Arabs, but just Kurds in the far north of the country in the mountains near Turkey. And in order to have like an equitable development of resources and industrial capability, they spread it out as much as they could, which is another element of Baathism, which is that all religions are effectively the same, and that Arabs are Arabs first. They're not Muslims or Christians or whatever first, and that non-Arabs in Arab countries should also receive some of the benefits of Arabs, because they don't really have anywhere to go, and genocide wasn't really on the table. Like, you could, in theory, just get rid of all the Kurds because they're not Arabs. Like, why would you give them Baathist policies? But they try to be conciliatory, mostly out of political nuance, because I think that the world would have reacted poorly if he tried to, wipe out an entire micro-civilization in the north of his country.
And also because, like, it's extremely cost-effective at this time. Like,
yeah.
It's literally easier to, like, just build the road north than to start a war. Like, you don't need to be, like, taking all of your shiny tanks and whatever and getting them all scuffed up, like, assassinating tribesmen when they're not really a threat to you at this point.
Yeah.
Because your regime is, like, reasonably stable and all of your threats come from, like, inside the army itself. And, like, you might as well sort of attempt to develop that area of the country so that you can extract resources from it in the future. Like, they weren't really short of resources at the time.
Yeah. And actually, they did pretty well. I mean, from 1960 to 1980, the real GDP growth of the country was 8% annually. And the real per capita GDP growth was 4.7% annually. Like, it was actually a decent time to be an Iraqi. One of the major areas where the Baathist party failed, and this later came back to haunt Iraq to this day, was purposeful lack of investment into their agriculture. So agricultural infrastructure, as well as the skills needed to take, one generation of farmers to the next, were all downplayed. And whatever wasn't downplayed was severely destroyed as a result of A, the Iran-Iraq War, and then B, the Gulf War, which completely wiped out the country's infrastructure. And because they eliminated like their agricultural supplies to a great extent and a lot of their water resources, they've had food shortages ever since, and it's hard to industrialize your country and fight wars if you keep people properly.
So one sort of extremely revealing thing that's actually historically fascinating, because it's one of the only times that this sort of thing has been lovingly documented on videotape. In 1979, immediately after Saddam had assumed power formally, he had been informally in power for a while, he convened an assembly of party leaders in July of '79 for an important announcement. And during the assembly, which he had ordered to be videotaped, he wheeled out this man, Mullah Abdel Hussein, who was like clearly had been badly beaten, to read out a statement to the effect that he was involved in a conspiracy within the Baath party to overthrow the government on behalf of Syria, and that he had a list of 68 co-conspirators within the party. So he begins reading out the names one by one, and as he reads out the names, he has a grab squad go out and grabs these guys out of the audience one by one, which is like, you should really watch this is on YouTube. We'll put it in the notes. It's fairly chilling, extremely Stalinist. After the list had been read, Saddam congratulated those still seated in the room for their loyalty. The 68 people arrested at the meeting were given show trials, found guilty of treason, and then roughly half of them were forced to shoot the other half.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean the whole having your own party leaders like shoot the other party leaders is a nice little twist on the whole getting buy-in from your polity dynamic. It's like,
yeah, I'm taking notes.
We're all in the same boat now, boys.
And it makes sense that if you just made this up, like this was just staged, why you would blame Hafez al-Assad, the man who was in charge of Syria at the time. Even though Hafez al-Assad, I believe, was a Baathist, essentially. He was an Alawite and a Shia-friendly Baathist, and most importantly, very friendly with Moscow. And the Iraqi-era Baathists were, in particular, pretty leery of Moscow, of the Soviets, and had hoped that the Baathist revolution throughout the Middle East would actually draw the Arab countries away from not only the U.S., but also the Soviet Union at the same time, and create a third way, as Gaddafi would later try and do. And it was this sounds like a great way to get back at someone you see as your ideological traitor, which would be, Hafez al-Assad and his family. And also get rid of anyone who might or might not be plotting a coup, but could at some point in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just straight internal politics. Like, I don't think there was actually some sort of a Syrian coup in the works, or any sort of coup, really. Like, all opposition at this point had been pretty adeptly dealt with. So, I mean, my view is just like, probably it's like, okay, so I've now assumed formal control from this guy who is basically like the Lenin of the Baath Party, is how it's been described. And like, nobody is going to try to out ideology because they're all going to be dead.
Right.
And if you have thoughts of doing this in the future, you will also be dead. So, the sort of major thing, the other major thing that happens in 1979 is the Iranian Revolution, which we did discuss in a previous podcast. This basically guts their armed forces. It cuts their oil revenue dramatically, while also spiking the price of oil, which benefits heavily every Arab nation. So Saddam sort of uses this as a golden opportunity to try to grab the oil fields in the southwest portion of the country of Iran, and he gives sort of what's actually it's a explanation, I guess, that this is an attempt to sort of prevent the spread of Islamism, as we now call it, like sort of like an actual Islamic ideology as opposed to sort of the secular Arabist ideology, to the other countries of the Middle East, particularly those with large Shia populations, like the Gulf states and Iraq itself.
Yeah, I mean, the oil fields of Iraq are primarily concentrated in the south, which is where the Shia population is most predominant.
Iraq is a majority Shia country, actually. I don't know if that's true in the Gulf states, but Iraq is Shia.
Yeah, it is.
Do any of you know, with respect to the oil in Iraq, if it's in the south, is it east or west of the Euphrates?
West, I think.
Do any of you know? West,
I believe.
I would say that it's pretty well distributed. I mean, we'll find one after the episode, which I should have done this beforehand, and we'll put it up on the YouTube video for the audience. But I'm pretty sure that the entire southern chunk of the country is just dotted in active oil wells, regardless.
And I think Basra
of the Euphrates.
Is the main city that's in that region.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The reason I ask, and maybe we'll get into this later, is that as y'all might know, the Yannan plan lays claim to all of Iraq west of the Euphrates.
That's that comes from the biblical, or one of the biblical descriptions of the borders of Israel.
I see.
That's not a.
So it's not. Yeah, I see what you're implying here. It's not going to be relevant to current sort of industrial geopolitical concerns like oil.
Right.
Gotcha.
Unless you assume that Israel has the mandate of heaven, and is placed right next to all this juicy oil. But
yeah,
we can defer that conversation. So the invasion goes okay. I mean, at this point, Iraq has like a decent for that area army. They have you can sort of like the bellwether of this sort of like small state military performance is like, do you have a decent air force? Because that's sort of the culmination of a lot of logistics and training. You have to have supplies of spare parts and jet fuel, all this stuff that makes it difficult to have an air force if you don't have sort of a competent, larger military apparatus. And both of these countries did at the time. Iraq manages to knock out a lot of infrastructure, grabs some amount of territory, doesn't manage to destroy most of the Iranian air force, but grabs sort of a chunk of territory. But then sort of ends up stalemating, particularly as the Iranians, instead of collapsing, sort of use this as an opportunity to deploy like the full force of like weaponized Islamic sentiments, with things like mass casualty attacks, these sort of light infantry infiltration tactics, and some actually fairly sophisticated employment of the remaining sort of like heavy strike capability that they have. So by 1982, really more like 1981, this ends up being a fairly bloody stalemate with very little sort of won, but much destroyed on both sides.
Yeah. And of course, this gets into one of the scars on Saddam's legacy, which is that of chemical weapons. So it was leaked a few years ago, the CIA documents, that the CIA was aware of Saddam's intentions to use chemical weapons as early as 1982. Had documented evidence by 83, even though the U.S. was publicly downplaying Iran's claims in the UN of chemical strikes on its soldiers. And by 84, had the CIA real hard evidence that he was acquiring and concocting what was known as turba GA, or some kind of like nerve gas, and that he was deploying it on the al-Basra front. Now, this was done mostly because of what Hank mentioned. The Iranians were beginning to utilize tactics like mass human waves, sort of a Soviet or Chinese tactic, and they were also willing to pluck people from, young boys from school and send them out to walk through the rocky minefields and clear mines. And basically, the Iranian leadership under Khomeini was able to unite the country pretty effectively against the Iraqis. And Saddam really had no choice, because the potential counter-invasion by Iranian forces, if he didn't use these chemical weapons, could have cost him his entire country.
I think it's also worth mentioning that there's evidence that the CIA even sold plans
I was going to get to
chemical
that.
plants.
That's conclusive. There's a really great book, if it's out of print, but you can still find it, called Spider's Web, and it has a large appendix of primary sources that detail some of the specific money flows and like how this stuff was financed and where it was bought.
So let's talk about the United States' involvement here. So this is right after the Iranian Revolution, where the U.S. ally, the Shah, was kicked out, and now Iraq, this country that's attacking the country that held U.S. Citizens hostage in one of the embassies for over a year. They're now looking at Iraq and saying, "Oh, look, here's a country that's going to attack this rival of ours." So there's that famous video of Donald Rumsfeld going to meet with Saddam Hussein, shaking his hand. I don't know exactly what they discussed, but there certainly was this motivation on the Americans' part to counterbalance the Iranian revolution and the force that it represented.
Well, they were playing both sides pretty adeptly.
Right. And they had to kind of apologize in some manner to Saddam after Iran-Contra was leaked.
How embarrassing.
Right.
Yeah,
so
it's a fun conversation to drop in on.
So there was a Guardian article released in 2002, right in the heels or right before the Iraq War starts, talking about how Rumsfeld actually went over to Iraq to give Saddam sort of implicit alliance over this issue of Iran. And it goes, in December, Mr. Rumsfeld, hired by President Reagan to serve as a Middle East troubleshooter, met Saddam Hussein in Baghdad and passed on the U.S. willingness to help his regime and restore full diplomatic relations. Mr. Rumsfeld had said that he cautioned, quote unquote, the Iraqi leader against using banned weapons, but there was no mention of such a warning in the State Department notes of the meeting. Howard Tyker, an Iraq specialist in the Reagan White House, testified in a 1995 affidavit that then CIA Director William Casey used a Chilean firm, Cardoan, to send cluster bombs to use against Iran's human wave tactics. Cluster bombs, I think, were being used by Assad recently, right? And he's been blamed pretty heavily for using
barrel bombs.
Barrel bombs,
evil,
okay.
Evil. Yeah, so this fixation on particular types of weapons is one of the things that really irks me.
Rules of murder.
Honestly, like the whole like oy vey chemical weapons thing even is like a bit grating. Like I don't see a moral distinction between dropping like a fuel air explosive that like clears out an entire trench from like, you know, a canister of like VZ or whatever that or VX that does the same thing. Like
I think it's visually jarring to see the victims of these weapons.
That, like,
keep in mind the usual suspects were weighing and veining about the hacking of in Rwanda when the Tutsis and the Hutus were hacking each other with machetes. So it has nothing to do with the sophistication of it. It's just something that happens with war propaganda, where you draw the attention.
Yeah, I mean, like the Western prohibition on chemical weapons is honestly more due to the fact that it doesn't really provide that much of an advantage when both sides sort of have symmetric capabilities there. Like the same reason why like armies don't tend to use hollow points. It's just like, okay, now everybody's just bleeding more, but it doesn't actually accomplish anything on that.
Yeah, I think it came about after World War One when Germany was using it to great effect, and I don't think the British and French had it as effectively, at least. And so they were essentially able to knock them out of the trench.
Advanced, but yeah, I mean they were employed, and you know there were plans in World War II. Like Churchill fully intended on using chemical weapons on any landings on the United Kingdom if there was an amphibious assault. And he was at one point in favor of gassing German cities before one of his advisors talked him off that ledge because, you know, like incendiaries are just as effective if you want to depopulate the area. Maybe even more so because you can't move back into the house that's burned down.
There's more evidence that the U.S. knew, or that there was a lot of sales coming from the U.S. to Iraq. In 1994, congressional inquiry also found that dozens of biological agents, including various strains of anthrax, had been shipped to Iraq by U.S. companies under license from the Commerce Department. Furthermore, in 1988, the Dow Chemical Companies sold $1.5 million worth of pesticides to Iraq, despite suspicions they would be used for chemical warfare. The only occasion that Iraq's use of banned weapons seemed to have worried the Reagan administration came in 1988, after Lieutenant Colonel Francona toured the battlefield on the Al-Fa Peninsula in southern Iraq and reported signs of sarin gas. Quote, "When I was walking around, I saw atropine injectors lying around. We saw decontamination fluid on vehicles. There were no insects. There was a very quick response from Washington saying, 'Let's stop our cooperation,' but it didn't last long. Just a few weeks," unquote.
Yeah, and the U.S. was far from the only country that was attempting to sort of use Iraq as a proxy and arm them as much as possible. Like the Saudis and all of the Gulf states were also heavily funding their military adventures through loans and allowing them to overproduce their OPEC quotas.
Right. And in 1987, CIA reconnaissance satellites pick up, I guess, clear indications that Iranian troops were going to come in through east of the city of Basra, and the DIA analysts were going over the satellite imagery, and they had determined that the Iraqi troops had made like several strategic errors in their planning and were very likely about to be crushed. And so basically what happened was they took this to Reagan, and they said that by the Iranians' 1988 spring offensive, which was on its way, it could very well be that Iraq could lose the war, and this could mean Iranian domination of the Iraqi oil fields in the south, which could then also put the U.S. ally of Saudi Arabia in massive danger. So Reagan told his Secretary of Defense, Frank Carlucci, quote, "An Iranian victory is unacceptable," quote unquote. So this was where the intelligence services of the United States and Iraq joined forces, and the U.S. provided Iraqi forces with satellite imagery and signals intelligence, the basic logistics analysis, and pretty much fed them enough intelligence where everyone kind of knew what it was going to be used for. No one ever said explicitly. But not long thereafter, the Iraqis again deployed a mixture of mustard and nerve gas against Iranian troops.
I wanted to point out real quickly that Carlucci, who you mentioned, he was CIA director from 78 to 81. And this is the Carlucci of Carlyle Group fame, which, again, probably another episode, but worth noting. We're talking about a very, very significant deep state actor.
So there's a really good book, the Saddam tapes by Mr. Kevin Woods.
Those tapes were released after, what was it, I guess right after after the invasion, they were grabbed, and then some think tank had some of the juicier bits transcribed, and they appear in this book. And the interesting thing is they go mostly from like before 1996, if I recall correctly, to like 1980 something. But they do have several interesting conversations about Saddam trying to sort of reverse engineer like what American policies are going to be. The his Gulf War analysis is extremely interesting. But with respect to the Iran-Iraq War, his concern and his sort of operating assumption, if you believe these tapes, is that the U.S. Was providing just enough aid to the Iraqis to ensure a stalemate, but was sort of operating in fundamentally bad faith by not actually allying or trying to ensure or even allow a victory on their part, which is, that's a plausible reading. Like, if you read what's kind of come out of the U.S. internal strategic discussions, that's not a implausible reading of it, actually, because they always keep referring to like preventing Iranian domination of the crucial Middle Eastern oil reserves, but that's their sole interest. Like, they have no interest in sort of stopping the bloodshed or like getting an actual favorable peace settlement. And his analysis of the Israeli connection in here, his being Saddam is who I'm referring to. He seems to view Israel as fundamentally interested in destabilizing the entire region and keeping it unstable and at war for as long as possible, which is also an extremely plausible reading of the situation.
That gets into some of the Oded Yinon plan.
Yes, it absolutely was. And he felt that Israel had a very good understanding of the situation that Iraq was in. He was also, by the way, a fan of the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. And
these transcripts are really funny. He's like, as the protocols inform us.
Yeah, right. Yeah, he was. Mossad attempted to kill him in the 70s with a bomb inside of a book, and it was another Iraqi minister.
And he never read again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But before we move on, after the Iran-Iraq War, I just want to point out a couple of very stunning visuals that always stuck with me. and I'll leave this to the video portions of our broadcast. But the fighter jets that were used on the Iranian side always captured my eye, because if you ever saw Top Gun, that was the F-14 Tomcat.
Of course. Yeah.
Flown by Tom Cruise and etc. And that's an American-built jet built by Grumman. Used to be made actually in upstate New York, which closed down, and Trump, made an appearance at the old factory to give one of his rallies because, look, we're going to reopen these, etc. when I get in power. But that was exported to Iran under the Shah. And after the Iranian Revolution, those exports were cut, obviously. But those were still used in the Iran-Iraq War in the 80s. And that was actually the biggest usage of that jet in history. And I think the number of kills scored by Iranian aces are second to none. I mean, they're in the hundreds, and they were knocking out Soviet-built airplanes on the Iraqi side. So it's kind of an interesting showdown between the sort of third generation fighter jets of the U.S. and Soviet arsenals that actually never happened between the two superpowers. But this is the proxy test of the two. And then later on in the Gulf War, which I hope we'll talk about soon, it was just a massacre. I mean, it wasn't even close between the Iraqis versus the more modernized versions of the American fighters. And,
it's very
the rest
interesting,
of the Air
Adam. Do you have anything on the tanks as well?
I mean, I don't think the Iranians had any American tanks. It's interesting. I don't actually know if they had much in the way of a land-based army, in terms of what I think the Iraqis probably had more tanks, but I'm sure artillery was used. And I think it's just visually, it always struck me as this interesting fact that Iran was flying the F-14 with the green of Iran on the tail. But I don't know too much about the ground forces. It was mostly human-based from the Iranian side, from what I can tell. I mean, they lost, I think, 1 million people. Yeah. It was just these people walking with machine guns.
Tactics were, so when we say human wave, you have this this image of kind of a World War I style where everybody gets up out of the trench and bum rushes, which is not inaccurate depending on what time period you're talking about, but they were a little bit smarter about that. What they would do would be to form sort of a super squad. In something like the U.S. Army, a squad might be a fire team of 4 or so people. The Iranians would put together 20 or 30 guys armed basically only with rifles, extremely light small arms. And they would basically have a sergeant or a lieutenant or something who would point and be okay, this squad rush this objective, this squad bum rush this objective, this squad bum rush this other objective. So they would suffer heavy casualties, which is why the squads were so large, because theoretically they would still be able to maintain some amount of operational ability, even if you have half of them killed. But it was not a bad tactic if you have just huge numbers of illiterate volunteers and not really a lot of time to train them or weapons to equip them with.
Yeah, and on the Iraqi side, the tanks were Soviet built, and they probably used them.
I think on both sides they have been T-72 versus T-72.
Yeah.
The only other anecdote that I have from the Iran-Iraq War, so circa 1982, it's clear that things are not going that well. And Iraq decides they want to try to propose basically a status quo antebellum peace treaty, everybody goes home. And as they're sort of discussing the negotiations in a cabinet meeting in Baghdad, the health minister, Riyad Ibrahim Hussein, suggested that Saddam could step down just temporarily as a way of showing good faith to Iran and cajoling them into a ceasefire, after which he could come back to power. Saddam asked the room if anyone else agreed with this idea. Surprisingly, nobody did agree with the idea. So he escorted his health minister to the next room, closed the door, and shot him in the back of the head with his pistol. Returned to the room and continued the meeting. So this is a guy who sort of if you're gonna try to like come up with a parallel, I just watched Goodfellas this afternoon, and like Joe Pesci from Goodfellas is kind of like how I picture Saddam like acting on a day-to-day basis, like, you know,
right, the famous scene where the waiter asks him, you know, a question and he shoots him in the foot, basically.
yeah. I'm a funny guy. I'd use you.
Well, that was the Henry, actually. But anyway,
I have another little Saddam story. During the Iran-Iraq War, he accused the marsh Arabs of Iraq. So in the distant part of the country, I think in the more north, they have these big open marshes that have been there for thousands of years. People have lived there since times of Mesopotamia. And he accused them of working with the Iranians. So he pretty much killed everyone who lived there, or if they didn't leave immediately. And then he like drained the wetlands to almost near destruction and dammed up the river near them so that they couldn't replenish, and basically created an ecological disaster because he thought these people were pro-Iranian or something.
Very
well, was it also like
the Stalinist population repression measures?
I was just going to ask, in much of the vein of the communists, I was just going to ask, was that purely out of malice to the people, or was it also like a crash drive in industrialization? I mean, the Chinese recently completed the largest hydroelectric dam in the world, and the Yangtze River.
I think it served both purposes. I mean, I'm sure it was like, hey, I'm going to employ a bunch of people building a dam. Like after we got rid of the fucking traders who live out in the swamp, like, you know, good riddance.
Right. Okay.
They're still around. That if anyone is worried, if we have any environmental listener, the site has been restored, and it's now a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
Well, hey, I'm okay with the environment not being a complete train wreck, but Team Human comes first, in my opinion.
I am an eco-fascist. This is well known.
Yeah, so were many people in history. Do you guys want to talk about how the war ended, and then I'm not sure on the interim between then and the Gulf War, but I have quite a bit to say about the Gulf War.
Yeah, go ahead, Hank. I wanted to get into Kuwait as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so circa 1988, I believe there was some United Nations negotiations after sort of heavy pressure for everyone. They had started to make the whole situation kind of bad for business all around, because there had been things like attacks on tankers, and of course, massive losses of life on all sides. Like a lot of the allies of Iraq were starting to not be as forthright with their support, particularly as the price of oil fell. So there were negotiations, and then a sort of UN-brokered ceasefire in 1988. I'm not sure if there was sort of a formal peace treaty, but the terms basically ended up being everybody goes home. There's no change of borders. There's no agreements of any sorts on sort of demilitarization or what have you. It's just 8 years later, and hundreds of thousands dead, and nobody has anything to show for it.
Yeah, I mean, of course, to my understanding, at least the maybe not the Iraqi people, but Saddam declared victory, and he had a lot of parades in his own honor after this. But I will ask, was there even any territory change? I mean,
No.
Did the border move?
No.
No, not at all.
Not at all.
I think there might have been like a couple of random islands, like postage stamp sized things in the Gulf.
Right.
But nothing in their sort of main territories.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't like there's a great visual. I think it comes right after this is said and done, where he is on like the back of a white horse and he goes under the two-sworded arch that he had built in Baghdad to himself. And I mean, certainly at home, for both Iraq and Iran, they portrayed it to their people as a victory. I mean, Khomeini really had no choice but to portray it as a victory. Like, we fought off this expansive Arab power that's trying to destroy our beautiful Shia Persian state.
Well, they could plausibly make that claim because their goal was defense and Saddam's goal was offense, and he failed. They actually succeeded, basically.
And I don't know how he pitched it to his people. I'm sure it was something along the lines of like, we I don't know, we tried our best, but we held them to concession, and we made great gains, and the Iranians will never bother us again after they saw the might of our forces. And meanwhile, there's hundreds of thousands either dead or missing in Iraq, or dead or wounded and missing. I mean, you have tens of billions of dollars in infrastructure damage and opportunity costs. Like, the whole thing is really a colossal failure for Saddam. I don't know how else to pitch it. He didn't even gain one oil well.
And not only that, I mean, just like the sheer destruction of capital, it's a bad situation to put yourself in when you sort of start a slugfest like this, with the sort of expectation that it could very well turn out badly. I mean, at one point they were spending 60% of their GDP per year, obviously borrowing heavily, on their armed forces, which is money that's not available even for things like your internal security, even from a selfish perspective. It certainly can't go towards economic development, which might very well be blown up anyway.
So the numbers on Wikipedia, real quick, on the Iraqi side, and the estimates vary depending on whom you ask and the research methods, but they were up to 160,000 killed in action, 60,000 missing. So, and some estimates say 600,000 were killed on the Iranian side, 500,000 killed, 400,000 wounded. Economic loss on the Iraqi side was 627 billion, and on the Iranian side, 561 billion. So over $1 trillion all told. And I'm sure that accounts for loss of production of their typical economies. But for a small nation like that is not exactly rich, as you say, 60% of your wealth going towards that's a big deal. For America, who's been fighting wars ever since I've been alive, basically, it's still a relatively rich nation. And so, take the Pentagon's budget, and it's like, 7% of the U.S. economy, at most. Well, but for these guys, it's just unbelievable.
He almost bankrupted the country. So there's a good figure regarding the total amount of private debt up till about 2005, when they were, George Bush was pretty much on the verge of declaring mission accomplished on the aircraft carrier. And Iraq owed to foreign banks, echoes on that, companies and governments, predominantly just through purchase of arms, from the time of, I think, Qasim till 2005, $130 billion. And this is a country that has never had more than a $50 billion GDP, I believe. Yeah. And the majority of this private debt for armaments was spent as soon as the Ba'ath Party got into power and was driven into hyperdrive when Saddam took full control. So in 79, Iraq was a net creditor nation, and it had a large amount of foreign currency reserves, like we said earlier, stable growing economy, and good, decent infrastructure, good industrialization programs, good social programs. All that's out the window by 89. It's completely wiped away. It's a debtor country. tens of billions of dollars in debt, no infrastructure. Hyperinflation is starting to set in. Price of oil is dropping rapidly. We'll get into that. That's part of the reason why Kuwait happens. And pretty much everything looks pretty terrible for the Saddam regime in Iraq. All the promises of the Ba'ath Party had been effectively undone, and they were quickly on their way to destroying the country.
So how does Kuwait get into this slant drilling business?
Yeah, Adam, you beat me to it. I was about to ask about that.
Who put them up to that?
Kuwait had loaned, along with all of the other Arab countries, had loaned Iraq about $30 billion. And Iraq had requested that, maybe we just let that slide. Just consider it a favor. The Kuwaitis are like, nah, we'd like our money, please. We're friends, but we're not best friends, if you know what I mean. The actual slant drilling. So we mentioned earlier how Iraq has oil fields kind of spread throughout the entirety of the south of the country. You can basically, when you drill for oil, you don't have to go straight down. You can kind of do a crazy straw type thing. It's not necessarily literally drilling down at an angle. You can go like down and then over, which is a nice way when you have these sort of irregularly shaped oil deposits as they become depleted. It can become a good way to extend the life of your well.
Nonetheless, pretty sophisticated engineering to be able to go down that far and then pull a 90, and just go over like that and push the thing down from the top. That's impressive.
Yeah, I mean, petroleum engineering is like fairly badass, and I wouldn't be surprised. Like Western companies are heavily involved in oil production in that part of the world, either directly or via like contracting certain parts of it, or just via training. So I wouldn't be surprised if like there was some Texan good old boy that demonstrated that particular thing for them. It's a little bit questionable why they would find it. Like, I mean, there's kind of a default assumption in the oil business that everybody's screwing each other as hard as they can, especially when you're dealing with sort of interstate conflicts. So it's not exactly surprising per se, given that they're both probably running all their wells full out. Like, I don't know what it would necessarily gain them in terms of like dollar and cents terms. And honestly, it doesn't seem like something that you would be all that upset about, unless you were just using it as a pretext to try to extort them out of either repaying your debt or some other sort of fiscal concessions, which, in my reading, is exactly what he was trying to do. It was just a hey buddy, you scuffed my shoes, you have to pay for that type thing.
So they
do we have
mm-hmm.
Do we have the so tensions sort of mount, and it's sort of unilateral in the tension raising. Eventually Saddam sort of masses his remaining armed forces on the Kuwaiti border, and people notice this because, like, they're big frickin' tanks. You can see them from space. And the American ambassador goes to have a meeting with Saddam, and I think was it Nick that had the quote from that?
It's April Gillespie.
Yes, I do. It's I have the transcript from that. This is a meeting that occurred between the U.S. ambassador April Gillespie, 1990, July of 1990, at the presidential palace of Baghdad. I think it's worth reading, actually, the whole of it, or at least the whole of the section I have here, not just the money quote, which will appear at the end. So here is Ambassador Gillespie. I have direct instructions from President Bush to improve our relations with Iraq. We have considerable sympathy for your quest for higher oil prices, the immediate cause of your confrontation with Kuwait. as you know, I lived here for years and admire your extraordinary efforts to rebuild your country. We know you need funds. We understand that. Yada yada. And our opinion is that you should have the opportunity to rebuild your country. We can see that you've deployed massive numbers of troops in the South. Normally, that would be none of our business. But when this happens in the context of your threats against Kuwait, then it would be reasonable for us to be concerned. For this reason, I have received instruction to ask you, in the spirit of friendship, not confrontation, regarding your intentions. Why are your troops massed so very close to Kuwait's borders? And the dear leader, Saddam, responds, as you know, for years now, I have made every effort to reach a settlement on our dispute with Kuwait. There is to be a meeting in 2 days. I am prepared to give negotiations only this one more brief chance when we, the Iraqis, meet with the Kuwaitis and we see there is hope, then nothing will happen. But if we are unable to find a solution, then it will be natural that Iraq will not accept death. Ambassador Glaspie, what solutions would be acceptable? Dear leader Saddam, if we could keep the whole of Shat al-Arab, our strategic goal in our war with Iran, we will make concessions to the Kuwaitis. But if we are forced to choose between keeping half of the Shat and the whole of Iraq, then we will give up all of the Shat to defend our claims on Kuwait to keep the whole of Iraq in the shape we wish it to be. What is the United States' opinion on this? And then here's the key. Ambassador Glaspie, we have no opinion on your Arab conflicts, such as your dispute with Kuwait. Secretary of State James Baker has directed me to emphasize the instruction first given to Iraq in the 1960s, that the Kuwait issue is not associated with America. And in the transcript, you have Saddam smiles.
Yeah, I'm trying to put myself in her shoes, and she's like,
that was July.
That was July. The big mustache knows exactly what that means.
Yeah. Well, the key thing to recognize about this exchange is that this took place in July the 25th specifically, and the invasion of Kuwait took place August the 2nd. There you go.
I'm trying to put myself in her shoes. It sounds like she's basically trying to relay messages from the White House and then take those messages back. I honestly don't think she expected a week later that there would actually be an open conflict between Kuwait and Iraq. She was probably trying to go back to D.C., get their sort of next message to be relayed back to Saddam, and then go from there. But I mean, this is where diplomacy is hard, because like you don't know what it's going to do.
She was asked about this in September of that same year. The journalist asked her, "Are the transcripts correct, Madam Ambassador? You knew Saddam was going to I did a Bushism. You knew Saddam was going to invade Kuwait, but you didn't warn him not to. You didn't tell America would defend Kuwait. You told the opposite. America was not associated with Kuwait. You encouraged his aggression, his invasion. What were you thinking?" And Ambassador Glaspie says, quote, "Obviously, I didn't think, and nobody else did, that the Iraqis were going to take all of Kuwait."
That's a stupid thing to say.
My credulity is being spread.
That's stupid.
Well, okay, so she has a little bit of a point. Like, so I mean, if you're sort of
so they'd be okay if they took 99% of it, but I mean, it's like, well, no, what's the right number?
It's like, what does the U.S. do? Like, the U.S. like fucking airstrikes some aspirin factory somewhere and like replaces the head of their central bank, calls it a day. Like, it's plausible that the U.S. would not have had an issue with Iraq, you know, like fucking up some Kuwaiti tourists or something that were in the country, or like blockading the country, or, you know, airstrikes, or even like, you know, cross-border raids, like you seize a couple of oil fields. Like, there were innumerable kind of like hostile actions that the U.S. could have been like, well, you know, we just want everybody to calm down a little bit, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, but, you know, like, don't make Iraq angry. You won't like them when they're angry. Maybe you should pay up. But yeah, I mean, like, there's a point at which, you know, your signal that like we wouldn't be okay, or like we'd be okay, like if you guys need to settle your differences outside, but that doesn't mean that like we're encouraging you to murder that guy.
So,
like, that's like a plausible reading of that transcript.
Yeah. So there's a couple ways we can
Hans.
look at this. Yeah, there's a couple ways we can look at this. One could be translation error. We know that Saddam did not speak English. Presumably, she didn't speak Arabic, and it could have been a simple miscommunication. Second of all, it could have been that she's just a fall guy. She was a convenient fall guy who fell on her sword for Bush Sr. and the State Department, who were trying to get Saddam involved in a war that they knew that they could get impetus for to finally crush him and to assert more dominance in the region.
Yeah, I don't necessarily know if that's true or not, but what I will say is that sort of concept seems to be a recurring theme, because there's a lot of things that go wrong in really any conflict that is often blamed on quote-unquote intelligence failures. And so that's sort of like this gray black box that you can kind of, as a politician, just say, oh, well, I had the best intentions, but, those guys in the CIA, which, are going to remain nameless for national security reasons, just weren't quite close enough to the intelligence assets, and we couldn't quite get it. There was translation error. There was something. It's like this ultimate excuse you can use, no matter however you want to spin it.
Kind of like we had intelligence that Saddam had those weapons of mass destruction. And
exactly.
He was going to nuke, nuke DC or something.
This is the excuse that Obama used every time they dropped a drone on a fucking wedding. Was there was an intelligence failure?
Right. Yeah. No, it's the entire history of the agency. I mean, I mentioned this in the episode we did on the CIA, but they attribute their entire 20th century legacy of regime change, domestic espionage, entangling U.S. apparatus in various bullshit conflicts. It's always like some mistake, this mistake, that mistake. It's a legacy of failure, because failure, as we know, is the impetus and rationalization for an expansion of the powers of these agencies. Is the crisis is the friend of these things, and they can admit a failure, because whenever they admit a failure, the follow-up to that failure is, well, we just need more power, we need more money.
I mean, this is Pinochet all over again, right? I mean, they were more directly involved and had a tighter friendship with Pinochet as the years went on, but they used him for similar purposes to take out a regional enemy or a regional group of enemies. And then when the time was right, they threw him under the bus, and they used it as impetus for some other cause, which was infiltration of NGOs in South America.
If we have any foreign dictators that are listeners to the program, just be advised, the CIA will not uphold any bargain. Do not cut a deal with them.
Yeah. So there's a good documentary that I will link. It's called Saddam, the Truth, and it interviews ex-Iraqi officials, people who knew Saddam, ex-U.S. State Department officials, White House officials, and so on. And it goes into the Saddam CIA stuff, but it also goes into the Kuwait crisis. And pretty much the Kuwaitis were dumping oil on the market at such a high volume, low price that it was crashing the Iraqi oil industry. Now,
wait a minute. It's a global industry, so why is Iraq the only one that is complaining? I mean, wouldn't the other countries like Saudi Arabia? Now, I mean, maybe I'm going to answer my own question. Were they being coerced by the United States to not say anything? I mean, how much do you have numbers on this? How much were they actually influencing the market?
So, for example, there's a good metric from the documentary. For every $1 that the price of oil dropped on the global market, Saddam lost about $1 billion.
Yeah, that you can sort of claim, but my argument is how much of that was Kuwait's fault, and then why were the other countries? Because they're also feeling the same dollar pinch. It may not.
The other countries weren't reeling from a war and had like an actual domestic economy.
I understand that part, but how much was Kuwait actually driving the price down? You may not know. I mean, I don't have it either. I'm just hypothesizing.
I mean, I'm sure it wasn't that much, and I'm sure we've seen this recently. Like Saudi Arabians willing to see the price drop at high volumes for extended periods of time, if it means that they can wrestle control over the global oil market. So will the Russians.
Sure.
So the Kuwaitis, and by the way, the Kuwaitis were just starting to develop the oil industry, and they have high quality, easily refinable oil, and they're obviously working with the U.S. government to get contracts for this oil. and they're producing it at high volumes that allow.
The government is actively helping the Kuwaitis, or the private companies are over there?
Well, I'm sure it's a mix of both when you're dealing with the United States.
Okay, I don't know.
I mean, these countries are highly well aligned with the United States. Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Oman, like their entire diplomatic sphere was around the U.S. since the 70s.
Yeah, I got you. Broadly speaking,
yeah. So these places are being propped up by the United States to get the oil market low. I'm sure this is also part of Bush's economic plan to keep the Reagan Revolution going, and not to mention that the Soviet Union was also effectively dying on the bed, and the best way to drive the knife as far deep as you could in the Soviets was drop the price of oil, which was one of the few profitable commodities they could sell.
Interestingly enough, when the UN had to vote on the resolution to send in, which was a real coalition, unlike the second Iraq War, to liberate, quote unquote, Kuwait, the Soviet Union, the USSR, was actually voting in favor of that, just to show maybe how weak they were if they couldn't resist.
They couldn't. I mean, the Soviet Union...
Because the price of oil actually skyrocketed during the war.
Yes, it did. I mean, once the war was on, once Saddam drew his line in the sand or whatever, and dared Bush Sr. to come and get him, the price of oil went through the roof. And I'm sure that Saddam was happy about that, but most of the people in the region necessarily weren't. But this, anyways, the whole point of this is the primary reason why Saddam was interested in Kuwait. It wasn't just territory acquisition. It was specifically oil well acquisition, because he needed to have a bigger amount of power in the oil market, because he had made several bad strategic errors prior to the Iran-Iraq war and had not balanced his economy properly.
So August 2nd, 1990, Iraq invades Kuwait. Hank, do you have anything on the lead up to the actual Operation Desert Storm?
Yeah, I mean, so this is really where you start to see, I mean, you saw it in the Iran-Iraq war as well, where Saddam was not really a military leader, and it seems as though he sort of intentionally depopulated his military of leaders.
I mean, he's a gangster, basically.
Yeah, I mean, he's classic gangster archetype, but he's not a strategist. He's not a soldier.
Right.
And he did this stunt where, if you just have one arm, then you can have a coup. So instead of one army, I'm going to have three armies. So he had the regular Iraqi army, he had the Revolutionary Guards, and then he had the Iraqi People's Army, I believe, is their sort of quasi-militia type thing.
They have a Fedayeen, the Republican Guard, and I guess the regulars.
Yeah, the Fedayeen were after the Gulf War, the lead up to the second Gulf War.
Got it.
But they sort of went out of the way to make sure that there was not strong leadership in the army. There are a lot of dead Iraqi generals who didn't die on the battlefield. If you're gunning for promotion, you have to very seriously consider whether appearing to be extremely competent is even in your best interests. So Iraq doesn't have a problem, obviously, sort of swallowing Kuwait, but then they just sort of stop. And the fear that is mentioned is the fear that the U.S. Iraq is going to also seize at least the Saudi Arabian oil fields, which are also sort of adjacent to this triangle of Iraq, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, which would make it extremely difficult, probably not impossible, but extremely difficult to actually invade Iraq. Because you would have to land troops in a hostile area, they would have to transit significantly more ground. But the Iraqis do not actually invade Saudi Arabia. Instead, what they allow is like the largest buildup of completely unopposed, mind you, buildup of forces in Saudi Arabia, Operation Desert Shield, that's ever happened in human history. Like hundreds of thousands of troops just kind of like calmly sailing up the Persian Gulf, landing in Saudi Arabia, and deploying in like attack positions all along the Iraqi borders, while Iraq does very little about it, which is just completely insane. It's crazy.
Yeah, the operation was really, I mean, just talk about like there's no other country on the earth that could pull this off, and the speed at which it was done as well. Considering that Iraq invaded in August and Operation Desert Storm after Shield took place, I think, in December. That's not that long. It's like 5 months or something, 4 months. So basically, they were airlifting with the U.S. Air Force C-5 Galaxies just pulling M1 Abrams tanks into the belly of these things. And these things are 60-ton vehicles. And I think the airplane can carry, at least 2. And so these things are flying back and forth between the East Coast of the United States all the way to the Middle East, going back, pulling these things out of Fort Bragg, wherever they're stationed, and they're just massing just a huge number of munitions. George Bush released 3 aircraft carriers. The United States is just unparalleled in terms of its military ability.
And this is immediately, the USSR was still technically around, but it was having major difficulties. It was clearly not a threat anymore. So this is like the apex of U.S. military strength that's devoted. Like their strategic goal is like, how do we stop like a bunch of Russian tanks from like storming through the Fulda Gap? So like, you know, their absolute like dream conflict is like, let's get some tank battles going in like flat desert terrain. Like that's even easier than like shooting at each other like through like the German forest and like rolling countryside. Like you can see this shit from space. Like you can send your planes and they can like see like tank formations from like hundreds of miles away. So they're not even hidden.
Yeah, not just that, but it wasn't Vietnam. And Vietnam is like probably one of the most difficult places to fight a war if you're not a native population.
Like, the Iraqis are like massing all of these formations. Like they're like lining up their shit and like, you know, digging in to some extent, but like you can only dig in so far if like they can find you and hit you in the first place if they have complete air superiority.
Yeah, the Air Force, the air superiority was probably the biggest factor in that entire war. And I've heard people compare it to like shooting fish in a barrel, but I would say imagine a barrel full to the brim with minnows, and you're attaching 2 high voltage transformer leads into the barrel and electrocuting the entire barrel full of minnows. There was no contest. I mean, the amount of aircraft that were deployed by the U.S., there were 34,000 sorties flown, and they knocked out, I mean, this is the first instance of the F-117 stealth bomber. It's not a fighter, it's a bomber, and they deployed that thing. That was the first wave. They flew it right into Baghdad. Basically the start of the attack, and they knocked out all the critical infrastructure that will knock out any dictator's command and control system, any military's command and control system. So they hit the power stations, they hit the communication stations, they knocked out the bridges, and these things were carrying these big, bunker busters, but they didn't really have to hit the bunkers. They just had to hit the comm and the power grid, and they did that. And they're stealth, and so they're flying in unescorted. They don't have any fighter escorts, unlike in previous wars where you had to send up multitudes of fighters to keep off the enemy fighters from catching them. They couldn't even see these things. They're flying in at night, and this is where the infamous footage of all that neon green illumination anti-aircraft fire is just thrown up into the sky over Baghdad. It's really incredible to look at. And all that was basically bombs blowing up in Baghdad, the Iraqi ground defenses, not knowing what the fuck is going on because they can't see anything. Their radars don't work. And they're just shooting into the entire sky because they don't know where the planes are. They don't even know if they're there. They're just trying in hopes of just knocking one out. I don't think they got one. I mean, it was unbelievable. And after they did that, they came in with the regular Air Force, and they're knocking out all the different radar sites, which are all linked up. So they're blowing up all the fiber optics or whatever they had. And they had these just crazy, like, electronics that just the Iraqis had no comparison to. And they were flying in their oldest jets, the F-4s that were used in Vietnam. And they had these radar detectors on them. And they would shoot these HARM missiles that would actually seek out the radar stations and just blow them up so that the rest of the Air Force could come in. And it got so bad that the Iraqis were actually turning their radars off because they didn't want to get blown up. And then the multitude of other aircraft would fly in. The F-15s, F-14s, F-18s, B-52s were just blowing these enormous holes in the once the ground invasion started, they were blowing these huge holes. They were over 1.5 miles square wide with just their cluster bombs. At that point, like, the Iraqis didn't even have any jets in the sky, and so they're just trying to vainly shoot them down with their shitty anti-aircraft.
Yeah,
and then,
the Iraqis were using like SPAAs or SPAAs, Strela 10s, Lavochkins, ZBU-2s. Like, these are all really shitty Soviet anti-aircraft weapons.
If you ever played this, I loved this game when I was a kid, but if you ever played the Electronic Arts game Desert Strike, I don't even know if this was like a CIA like Mockingbird project, but it was literally like, they didn't name the guy, but it was like, a desert madman has taken over a small country in the Middle East, and your job as the Apache helicopter pilot is to go in and knock out all the SAMs. And so I learned all this shit as a kid, but it was like, you're flying these Apaches, which again are like these incredible pieces of technology that have these like radomes on the top, and they got these sensors on the front. They can pick out everything. They can fly at night. They have night vision. Then they have satellites going over there's no contest. It's ridiculous. And the Air Force just totally obliterated everything. And then once the ground came in, I mean, it was just mopping up.
I mean, some of these weapons that the Soviets had given to the Iraqis, like the 100 millimeter air defense KS-19, the Iraqis are actually using this in this war. This was developed like in the Korean War for the North Korean side by the Soviets. So they're using at that point, 40-year-old tech to try and fight Apache gunships. And I believe we had F-18 Hornets at the time, or F-16s
everything.
at the time.
Everything was flying. I mean, the F-14s were out there. They could track 24 targets simultaneously. And I don't know what the fucking Iraqis can do. I mean, and then they had 707 Boeing AWACS flying over, coordinating the entire operation with all these hundreds of jets, floating around. It's just, there's no way you could fight the U.S. if the U.S. is willing and able, and they were at the time, and they still probably are. The people probably won't put up with it, but at the time, the UN gave it the mandate. So this military is just ridiculous.
So there was also like a series of small, really decisive naval battles. I think Iraq had going into this the fifth biggest navy in the world by just sheer number of ships, and it was most of it completely sunk in the space of like 20 minutes by the by the U.S. fleet. It was just a complete slaughter.
Yeah, I didn't even hear anything about the Navy like doing anything other than just launching F-18s and shit. But it was, I mean, the only thing that Saddam actually was able to do was they were able to launch these Scuds. These Scud missiles, which are these pieces of shit designed by the Soviet Union that have no guidance system on them. And they're just these big dumb tubes of rocket propulsion. And then there's a warhead at the top. No guidance. So you just basically have to look at your artillery tables and you're like, yeah, aim that way. And then they roughly kind of get it in like maybe a multi-kilometer perimeter of something. But the other thing that the U.S. had was these precision guided bombs. They had all the laser guidance on some of the bombs. They also had assists from some of the soldiers on the ground. Once that started off, they could paint, the target and all that. So the Scud had none of that, and all they were doing was basically just trying to use them as terror weapons, quote unquote, to what they were trying to do is they were trying to drag Israel into the conflict, because if that happened, Saddam theorized that they could ally with the Arabs because they're not going to let Israel get in on that. So he thought that was his one hope. And so they did actually successfully knock down, or they were able to hit multiple targets in Israel, Tel Aviv in particular. And then to respond to that, this is the first usage of the anti-ballistic missile systems on the U.S. side and in the world, actually, using the Patriot missile systems. And the claims were, and this is bullshit. I mean, there's a press conference where Schwarzkopf was basically saying that 33 out of 33 Patriot engagements were successful, and that's not even close. They were probably
no way.
They were saying that maybe 2 out of 10 at best were hitting the Scuds, but the fact is, like, they were able to cut down on the Scud strikes. At the end, they cut it down, I think, by about 90%. But that's in combination with the Air Force knocking out the launchers, and just throwing the whole army into a disarray. Even though they were not able to successfully find a lot of the mobile launchers during the air war, those were the most
there's
difficult to find.
There's a really nice book called Bravo 20 by Andy McNab. He was a British SAS soldier who went on a couple of Scud hunting missions in the first Gulf War. It's a really great read if you like sort of on the ground military nonfiction.
One other thing about the...
also as a reminder, you mentioned Schwarzkopf. I just wanted to point out that that region of the world is some kind of family occupation. Schwarzkopf's. We mentioned in the Iran episode that it was his father, Norman Schwarzkopf Sr., who was the man on the ground during World War II in Iran for the U.S. military.
Oh, interesting. Right. Well, speaking of Iran, this is one other sort of interesting anecdote. So you guys, if you remember when Trump was sort of talking to, maybe it was Maria Bartiromo, talking to him about the Syria strikes a few months ago. And it was these Tomahawk missiles that were launched from some naval cruiser. And he was going on about how amazing the technology was and blah, 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 blah. I mean, these were used in the Gulf War. I mean, they're not new, first of all. And they were developed, obviously, prior to that. But the interesting fact about them during the war was they didn't have guidance systems set up for the Iraqi terrain. And they were designed, actually, because you had to program them. They didn't have any, there was no, like, cellular network. There was no satellite comms. It was basically just pre-programmed with the target. They load that up onto firmware on the missile itself, and they launch it, and that's it. Like, you can't control it remotely. So they couldn't program the sensors on the missile to track where it was going and compare it to its pre-logged maps on the system, and compare that to what it's seeing on the ground, because the terrain in Iraq is too featureless. It's like these shifting dunes, and it's just, there's nothing there really that you can kind of program into a map reliably. So what they had to do, and this is actually based on the fact that they had these missiles basically pre-programmed to fire at the Soviet Union, because they were going to go over from the Persian Gulf over Iran and into the Soviet Union. And what they did was they reprogrammed them to follow the path on Iran, because the difference with Iran is that there's mountains. So they're able to program the missiles to follow the terrain that's not shifting, the terrain in the mountain in Iran, and then veer left once it gets up to where Baghdad is, and then strike. And that's how they pulled those off. They fired, I think, 54 of them in the first night. But to me, what's interesting geopolitically is that they didn't tell Iran they were doing that, and they were violating their airspace.
Right. That is a very good point, Adam. Do y'all remember, just as I couldn't fail to mention, do you remember what Brian Williams had to say about that strike?
Oh, it was ridiculous. It was just. Do you remember what he said? But I remember. It
yes,
was,
I do.
Glowing
he quoted
terms.
the Jewish singer / poet Leonard Cohen and he said, "I am blinded." It's from Leonard Cohen's song "First We Take Manhattan." I am blinded by the beauty of our weapons.
Fucker.
Yeah, dude. It's just. I think I don't know about him, but people who really don't know. Frankly, I mean, I include us in this. I mean, our skin is not in the game. And I remember hearing this skips ahead a little bit, but I think it's relevant. There was a soldier, one of the Marines or Army guys, that was talking to the camera about engaging the Iraqi soldiers and how cowardly he thought they were. Because basically what they would do is they would take a couple pot shots and then retreat and regroup into kind of a more hunkered down area of their city because they couldn't engage fully. And he's calling that, he's not coming at us, as men, and he's got like this, what is it, that chaw or whatever they put in their lip, the baseball players chew. And he's just denigrating these guys, calling them cowards. And look, I know a soldier has to hate his enemy. All right, I get it. That's fine. But to call these guys cowards, I just find that ridiculous, given how overwhelming the force is on the U.S. side. I mean, talk about being a coward. Why don't you take off all of your military armor and your air support and your GPS systems, and you go fight, in sandals against the U.S. military? I mean, give me a fucking break.
Most of these guys are just like conscript soldiers. Like you're drafted into like Iraq's army.
Yeah,
like,
I mean, famously, it was the his guard. What did they call the elite?
Revolutionary Guard.
His Revolutionary Guard. I mean, it was they
Republican
made a big
Guard,
propaganda coup over the fact that the Revolutionary Guard themselves didn't put up a significant fight. But I just wanted to say, I mean, well, with that, no one has ever said that about the Taliban.
Yeah, yeah, right. I will say this. I mean, there's something about the Arab, the Sunni Arab, that is sort of unique in that they display this sort of. They're pretty brutal to their captives. I mean, there's footage of these guys. Saddam was a torturer, right? But like, there's footage of these guys like kicking their enemies and just all this really crass shit. But at the same time, like if they're captured, they start begging for mercy because they expect their enemy to just be brutal and unfair, basically. And that's kind of how I characterize these guys roughly.
I mean, the reputation. Like, I think this was even an aside in the book that I mentioned, is that you don't want to be captured by Arab armies.
Oh,
because
God,
you'll just be
no.
beaten and sodomized to death.
Of course not. Yeah.
Oh, so they did do the sodomizing too.
Yeah, you can't have a good war without some sodomy.
All right.
So I have a couple comments. I mentioned briefly earlier the naval destruction of Iraq. So that was spread out over two battles, the Battle of Bubiyan and then the Battle of Khafji. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Khafgi. And really beyond was where 21 of the 22 ships that Iraq had deployed were completely sunk in the space of 13 hours, majority of them being sunk almost instantly when coming into contact with the British Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy. And then Battle of Khafji, so Saddam tried to launch a counterattack, and that counterattack was completely wiped out by the American forces, and that was pretty much the end of the Iraqi Navy as it stands. I don't think the Iraqis have really had a Navy since then. And by the way, there were no losses on the U.S. side, not one casualty. Not one ship, not one dead sailor.
No, look, in the U.S. Navy, I mean, come on. It's like there's maybe Russia has one aircraft carrier that's got rust all over it, and then there's one that they gave to the Chinese. U.S. Navy has, I think, at least 9 aircraft carriers, at least. And then multiple bases all over the planet, multiple air bases. It's just... Again, it's there's nothing like this. I mean, the British didn't even have anything like this.
I mean, at this point, the U.S. is developing naval guided missile warfare. So you have naval ships; they can hit your ship with pinpoint accuracy without even being in total line of sight.
Yeah, the one thing I worry about, just getting slightly off topic, but just current event stuff, is the U.S. Navy. is very vulnerable to submarines, I would argue. I mean, they could basically slip something in if they've got the right stealth technology and just blow up one of those carriers. And then there's also a lot of very good anti-ship missiles that the Chinese have worked on, I've heard. I'm not an expert on it, but I would say given all the capital that is invested in those machines and the escort fleets, you could fuck up the U.S. if you figured out a way to target those carriers.
Yeah, so there's two incidents related to that. A couple years ago, doing a Pacific drill with some allies, and in the middle of the drill, a Chinese submarine in the middle of the U.S. battle group, and the U.S. battle group had no idea until it literally surfaced right in the middle of them.
That's a big
and
deal.
Secondly, the Chinese have unveiled more recently a hypersonic missile with help from the Russians.
I think Russians built it. I don't think the Chinese have a very good rocketry program as of now. But
this is basically a carrier killer. So this thing flies at hypersonic speeds and glides just above the waves underneath U.S. radar and the Aegis defense system. So not even the traditional, but the newer methods of anti-missile defense that the U.S. has set up for its carrier strike groups is pretty much rendered null by both Chinese submarine stealth technology and I would say land-to-sea missile technology at hypersonic speeds.
Sure. Getting back to the Gulf War, I have a little bit on the land war, which was very short, actually. It's only 100 hours. But Hank, do you want to direct where we go?
No, I mean, so the Gulf War is a disaster for Saddam. It's a complete blowout. Casualties on the U.S. side are minimal.
146 were killed, and 25% of those were from friendly fire.
Right. I mean, it's
wow.
Like it's literally.
However, it should be noted that there were some serious weird health problems that were occurring in
Gulf War.
There's all sorts of rumors that nobody knows what the hell Gulf War syndrome really is. That's why it's a syndrome and not a thing. It's just a collection of symptoms. But there are suspicions that it may be related to having struck Iraqi chemical weapons, which, although not used, were deployed and dispersed throughout the country. It may have been related to some even like side effects of the anti-chemical warfare injections that were given.
Yes, that's one of the primary theories. And in addition to that,
anthrax vaccines, I believe, also may have caused that. And like honestly, like a lot of the soldiers that were deployed, like that was sort of the first major deployment. And there's all sorts of nasty shit if you happen to be in like a Navy vessel for a large amount of time. Like there's all sorts of toxic shit down there. So like honestly, God only knows. Like it could be a bad batch of MREs for all anyone knows.
Well, if I recall correctly, when Norman Schwarzkopf testified, he actually, I believe, broke down in tears regarding the chemical incident of the things being targeted.
I'm by default extremely suspicious of the whole crying general, crying politician situation.
Yeah, well, not unreasonably so, man. But I'll just throw that out there for listeners. I didn't really have anything much on that. I just wanted to mention that though the casualties were low, there was a large number of people who suffered some strange medical conditions because of who knows what exactly. We can't answer that here, but that
was the subject of like several X-Files episodes too.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
It was big. It was a big part of the U.S. cultural conscience was this sort of mystery illness.
Well, in the 90s, there wasn't much going wrong, frankly. So it was like,
that's
what they fixate on.
And the war went so well. It's like people are obviously just kind of looking for something to go. It's like, oh
yeah, like you'll see this pattern where like you're looking for like after you get done with the story, you're like trying to reflexively counter signal in your news coverage.
Yeah.
So you end up with like kvetching about the highway of death, where like shot a large number of retreating, not surrendering but retreating Iraqi army units.
Yeah, I can talk about that. It was a 3-mile long convoy, quote unquote, actually, is what I would argue. But what it was is basically after the American ground forces swept through the minefields, they totally obliterated those things. They actually, I was impressed. They had the Marines actually out on their knees with bayonets poking in to get the mines identified first. But then they would just send these tanks over the fields with plows on them, and so they just drove through it. But once they got Iraq forces out of Kuwait, they were, or the cities at least, they were flying up this road, this one road that goes back to Iraq, and they were not using the deserts because actually 98% of the vehicles were not military. They were civilian vehicles, Kuwaiti, by the way, that were stolen, from what I gather, and they were filled with loot. So they were not exactly innocent. I mean, they're not just fleeing for their lives. They're basically looting the country. Nonetheless, what the Air Force did was they knocked out the head and the tail of the convoy so that they couldn't get out, and then the cars were just stuck there. So they did that blow at night, and then they came in over the next 2 days, and they just blew the shit out of it. And surprisingly, there were only reportedly only about 200 people killed, which seems low given the footage of what those cars looked like when the U.S. military were done with them. Because they were basically, it looked like you lit a huge flamethrower on the thing. Just 2 miles of cars just blackened and torched. And 2% of them were military.
I mean, by that point, it's pretty clear that things are going wrong, and you're a giant, moving, concentrated target. So I would not be surprised if, everybody who had any sense was like, okay, war's over. I'm running perpendicular to this.
Yeah, those guys jumped out. I mean, if you have 2 days, those guys jumped out of the cars. I mean,
I can't help but mention the loot. Like, if any of you haven't seen the 1999 film Three Kings with Wahlberg, Clooney, and Spike Jonze.
Oh, that's a great movie.
I highly recommend it. It takes place in 1991 in the Iraq War. People trying to make off with some loot, but it's a good movie.
Yeah. But that event was really important because the press, of course, played it up, and they called it a turkey shoot. And it was like Bush started worrying about, I guess, his poll ratings, and he started telling the army, who was only a couple days in, or maybe 3 days in at this point. The total was 100 hours. That you guys need to wrap this up. Our goal is to get this guy out of Kuwait, not take the whole Iraqi army down, which was later criticized, by the way, but. The command was basically, you need to wrap this up, and you've got a few more hours to do it. And it was a lot of it had to do with that event.
So, I mean, we're kind of wrapping up the Iraq War, so I'll say that this ended up costing Iraq immensely. So it was like $237 billion in today's money of infrastructure damages to Iraq as a result of this war. And on top of that, Iraq got hit with a $172 billion bill over the course of the 15-year period from that war up until just after the end of the second Iraq War, by Kuwait, by international organizations, by companies, so on. So several $100 billion down the hole for Iraq. Saddam's economy completely tanks. Oil production slows to below 1 million barrels annually. And interestingly, to Adam's point, that they didn't want to take out the Iraqi military. There's a great clip where they ask Dick Cheney, who was working with Bush Sr. at the time, why didn't you go into Baghdad and take out Saddam?
He was defense secretary.
Right. And he was very adamant as to why they wouldn't, and we'll link it. It's a great clip because Dick Cheney essentially predicts in the early 90s everything that goes wrong with Bush Sr.'s invasion plan of Iraq and the removal of not only Saddam but the entire Baathist
Bush Jr.
Bush Jr. Sorry, Bush Jr. Yeah, the removal of Saddam and the entire Baathist infrastructure. So basically, Cheney says, we know that if we went in and we took out Saddam, the country would splinter, And it's very possible that you could see territory acquisitions by its neighboring countries, or you could see rebellions in the Sunni and Kurdish regions. You could see a complete collapse in the oil output. I mean, he goes on and on and on. And he in a very articulate way, in a very forceful way, predicts literally everything that has happened the last 5 years in particular, with the rise of ISIS and the splintering of Iraq, where, and it looks like Iraq by 2020 will not be a cohesive state at this rate.
So, Hank, do you want to take us after the Gulf War through Saddam's removal?
Yeah. So the Gulf War concludes, and in an effort to basically not get into a clusterfuck of unknown magnitude, Saddam is left in power, but there's sort of this weird pattern where we attempt to sort of neuter or contain or sanction him, and in my reading, attempt to convince some sort of internal element perhaps to depose him, which makes minimal sense. This picture of him as a madman is not accurate at all. Like, he's acting not competently perhaps, but extremely rationally according to what he sees his interests as and his view of the world. So in his tapes that he has made, they're discussing whether they could get rapprochement with Clinton, if the fact that there is a Republican Congress is going to help them at all. They're basically seeking to be integrated with the world economy and the world political system. But of course, this is not allowed to happen. Increasing levels of sanctions are applied. There's some amount of internal turmoil with the Kurds, who were foolish enough to trust the CIA. Never do that, let's reiterate. And rebelled during the Gulf War and were mercilessly crushed.
Also, the Shias were rebelling in the south, and this was one of the things when they were negotiating the peace, quote unquote, the peace settlement with the United States. The Iraqis conceded to all demands, but they made one request, and people who are there or looking at it or close to the situation say Schwarzkopf magnanimously just kind of gave them, threw them a bone when they requested for their usage of the helicopters. And what they did with this, and I don't think it occurred to Schwarzkopf, but most people say this was a mistake, but because subsequently they set up this huge no-fly zone over the entire southern part of Iraq, probably because of this. But what they were doing was they were flying these helicopters and shooting at the Shia uprising in the south.
Yeah, so, I mean, it ended up being effectively a very stable state because, ironically, when you have a very poor state, you're forced to become very dependent on the government. And given that, most of the Iraqi government, because of the sanctions that prevented them from having any sort of domestic economy, they became completely subsistent on oil revenues in this various oil for food or oil for kickbacks, effectively, arrangement. They weren't really able to rearm their military to any substantial degree. But if you have a population that depends on deliveries of grain that you secure, then you're not going to have any problem controlling them. So Saddam faces very few serious internal threats to his rule. Flash forward to 2001 and the September 11th attacks, which rapidly get used as an excuse for various geopolitical reasons to invade Iraq. So, of course, you have this propaganda battle on both sides where Saddam is promising the father of all battles to compare with the mother of all battles in the Gulf War.
Do you know what Saddam calls these wars? By the way, we call it the Gulf War, the Iraq War. I mean,
I thought it was didn't he call it, like, wasn't it the mother of all battles, or was it?
Well, what I'm getting at is the Vietnamese call the Vietnam War the American War, right?
Right.
So I wonder what he thinks of, because I mean, like, the mother of all battles. I mean, from his perspective, of course, but yeah, I'd have to look up the Iraqi page of the Iraq
like
War, the Arabic page.
Yeah, yes, the Iran-Iraq war. But regardless, like, there are these elaborate promises that, like, oh, there's going to be, like, we're going to drain the oil into these ditches and light them on fire, and we have all of these elaborate defenses planned, and we're going to make Iraq into a Vietnam. I'm bypassing entirely the issue of the weapons of mass destruction, because I don't think it's actually relevant at all to our decision to knock over this country.
Well, just to lend some support to you, there was a very famous former weapons inspector, which was in 2001, timing interestingly enough, before the Iraq invasion, accused of soliciting sex with a minor, Scott Ritter. But he later said that this was timed politically to discredit him. But he was basically saying that the Iraqis, weren't cooperating with the inspections. He wanted to go back in, but the Bush case for them having the types of weapons they were claiming was unfounded. So you can look him up. But I remember him being on the media when the Iraq war was happening, or right before it at least. And he was a big critic of this, and he was a former weapons inspector, so he has some credibility, unlike some journalists or us. I mean, we weren't there, but he can speak to it from firsthand experience.
Yeah, I mean, it would make total sense. Like, there is a narrative that I've read that, like, Saddam was trying to pursue a policy of strategic ambiguity from, like, roughly the end of the Iran-Iraq war until the end of the second Gulf War, as far as what his exact chemical and biological weapons capabilities were. Like, it was just. I
mean,
like,
Israel does that. They're like, well, we don't have nukes,
they're
but we want it to be understood that we do.
Sense that, like, if you ask them, they won't tell you. But, like, I mean, come on, like. Right. But I mean, also, nuclear reactors are just, like, big honking things. Like, they require a lot of resources to build that Iraq didn't have.
Well, Israel did blow up, I think, one of Iraq's reactors.
Yeah, but that was 1981, and that was basically as far as their nuclear program. 81 or 83. That was as far as they got. Like, they did have a research reactor at one point, but I mean,
yeah. Do you guys remember all those vaunted Iraqi scientists that were defecting right before the war happened, and they were like, "Oh yes, we have many weapons of mass destruction." Thank you, America.
Which, okay, like, again, the notion of, like, chemical.
Thank you for my luxury resort in the Poconos that I've now owned.
Like, who remembers the like chemical weapon attack on that furry convention a few years ago?
That was fucking hilarious. It was a chlorine attack.
Yeah, I mean, like, chlorine gas will kill you really dead, and
it was not very effective, though.
Unfortunately,
it was not in that situation. But I mean, like, chlorine gas is extremely easy to manufacture. Like, you're literally talking about a 1910 level of industrial base. Like, you have to be really dirt poor before you can't manufacture some toxic gas or another. Like,
it's basically like Fight Club levels of chemical warfare.
Yeah,
it's just like, we're just going to make this in our kitchen.
Yeah, it's stuff that you end up producing in the context of, like, petrochemical. Like, like, xylene, like, was originally developed as a fucking nerve toxin, and that's not as up on my chemistry as I used to be. My understanding is that that's produced in trace amounts for all sorts of petrochemical processes. So, I mean, like, who doesn't have chemical weapons, really? Now, the extent to which they're weaponized is another, or, like, attached to delivery vehicles, whatever. But, like, I wouldn't consider it a problem in that neighborhood to be armed to the teeth. And I don't think that they were, and I don't think that we cared that they weren't. I think the decision to invade was totally with respect to the broader geopolitical aims of like just destroying the country.
Well, not just that country. I mean, Wesley Clark says he spoke to either Rumsfeld himself or a representative of Rumsfeld who was like going back and forth. But he had asked, is Iraq, our final objective? And we said, no. There's 5 countries we need to go after in the Middle East. Iran, of course, and well, look at now, Syria. Lebanon was hit by Israel after Iraq in 2006, I believe. What else was there? I don't know, but
Sudan.
Yeah, this was a joke.
They hit Sudan with the secessionist crisis from South Sudan. Yeah, like
the fucking joke at the time was we have an exit strategy from Iraq. We'll leave through Syria, or like we'll swing through Iran on our way out. Like the entire region was slated for destruction. So. The second Gulf War, the second Iraq War, the second American War, depending on which side you're on, kicks off. We do the whole shock and awe thing, basically completely conquer the country, again, extremely rapidly. Saddam goes into hiding almost immediately after surviving an attempted decapitation strike by the United States. And it's unclear sort of how much operational control, if any, he had over any faction of the insurgency that immediately developed. A lot of that was presumably sort of distributed Sunni insurgency by people who had been, for instance, in the Iraqi army and demobilized and had nothing to do and no prospect of employment in the new Shiite-dominated Iraqi state. But he is discovered in 2006, I believe, after sources say the owner of the villa that he had been staying at turned him in by a combined U.S. Special Forces and I believe Kurdish commando unit. Drag him out of his so-called spider hole with a unloaded and quite nice Glock 18C next to him, unfired in his attempts to evade capture. He's then tried and hanged by the neck until dead, but not before giving a very interesting series of interrogation tapes, which I would highly recommend a book, Debriefing the President, the interrogation of Saddam Hussein, where one of the CIA analysts goes into his analysis of those transcripts. And thus ended the actually fairly long, especially by the standards of the region, but quite brutal and ultimately ignominious reign of Saddam Hussein.
Yes, so it is. The ruler who allows rape while he is still alive and his people are not destroyed by the rape. That ruler is marred by shame. His people, if they continue to submit to such a king, will be covered with shame as well. Yes, rape is unbearable for any soul, for the history of a nation, or for any free man. A betrayal of a king is bitter, but a betrayal against the people and the nation and its history is 100-fold more bitter. Zabibah wiped her tears, but when she started answering the king's questions, telling him about what had happened, tears continued to flow, making it difficult for her to speak. So she told her story, mingled with tears, until she had revealed everything to the end. At first, the king was furious with rage, but then he composed himself. He listened with great sorrow. He kept repeating out loud, "The plot of those who dared do this was very painful and hurt me more than an arrow in my eye. But I swear by the Lord of Zabibah and by her purity, my soul sees, my mind understands, and my conscience feels that we will wage a war against them, and we will not stop till we are directed by the will of Zabibah's God, Allah, merciful and compassionate. The king will wage a war so that the heroes become heroes, so that the banner of truth flies high over the land, and so that the people have somebody who will be worthy of becoming its conscience and who will defend it. And if Allah, the host of the highest kingdom, desires for my soul to go up to that would be a great honor for me. And then the sky would be a paradise, and the earth would be its gates. May all the evil plotters be vanquished.